militia's fortifications. And what's interesting is that Virginia in April of 1861 really decided to secede, but they said we're going to leave it to a vote of... Virginia was not formally out of the Union until that vote was cast. But the Virginia State Militia began preparing for the war. These men, Mallory, Baker, and one other gentleman, they began to prepare for this moment. And they wait until the vote is cast. After the vote is cast, then they know that Virginia is now in the Confederacy. That's when they go into Union lines, and they argue that they are being used for the Confederate war effort. Butler uses that argument to justify not returning them, not obeying the Fugitive Slave Act. And so that's the term contraband that we get. So it's Butler who coins the phrase, but it's really these three African Americans that come in on their own initiative and convince Butler that this is something he should do. And Congress authorizes this type of confiscation in August of 1861, and that begins the stampede into Fortress Monroe. You get thousands that come to Fortress Monroe, and this battery was organized at Fortress Monroe.
Oh, that's great.
That's great.
Our exhibit is entitled The Glorious March to Liberty, and we begin our exhibit dealing with the first arrival of enslaved Africans or indentured enslaved Africans in the North American British colony. And what's interesting about this, and we take note, is that the enslaved persons that are brought to North America, to Jamestown in 1619, were initially the cargo aboard a Spanish slave ship called the San Juan Bautista that was built in Japan. And we take note again, I mentioned this earlier, that these are skilled laborers that are coming in to help the colony survive in North America. A number of our captives are, of course, prisoners of war, and so we deal with that fact on our intro panel. We mentioned Colonel Abdullah Rahman Ibrahima early in the exhibit. We point out that these are highly sophisticated Africans, that in the case of Colonel Abdullah Rahman Ibrahima, he was a college graduate.
Is that him?
No, this is just an example of an African Moor.
Okay.
But I will show you in the exhibit a lithograph, a digital copy of a lithograph of Colonel Ibrahima. We do have his image in the exhibit. And
Is that a village?
this is a Fulani village in West Africa. And of note, it is important to note that Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, and Choctaw villages in North America are built to the same type of template or model, if you will. Now, as we move into the Revolutionary War, one fact is important. It is that during the Revolutionary War, leaders of the war effort, the colonial or American war effort, understood that if they were to win, they needed the help of the African and African descent soldier. And this is one of my favorite newspaper prints from that era. And it's the Blind to the Military Necessity, a view of America in 1778. And this is a congressman, a continental congressman, who's blind to the military necessity of using African descent folk. So they're commenting on this during the Revolutionary War, that it's a military necessity that we use Africans and African descendants if we're going to win our independence. And we do comment on the fact that without the help of men like James Armistead, the key spy that leads to the victory at Yorktown, this independence may not have been won. Again, military necessity.
Now, could you
Yes.
elaborate on?
On James Armistead?
Yes.
James Armistead was a double agent who worked for Lafayette, General Lafayette. However, the British commander thought that he was loyal to him. And so he was assumed to be a loyal British spy, when in fact he was a loyal Revolutionary or Continental Army spy, and his information to the Continental Army, I said Union, but to the Continental Army was critical in the victory at Yorktown. Now, I also want to point out that
He was African?
he was an African descent spy, yes. An enslaved man, actually, who does earn his freedom by working for the Revolutionary War effort or the Continental Army. I do want to point out that General Washington said to the Continental Congress that since the British had more manpower and more firepower, that deception was key in winning the war. And the African descent spy is key to the successful deception that wins the war. Now, after the Revolutionary War, we see men like Prince Hall, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, Paul Cuffey, who really become early civil rights leaders. And we talk about their work as early civil rights leaders and in our community how we're organizing the African Union Society and various African societies that help mutual aid societies that help take care of our community, which is a good example of how we've been taking care of ourselves since the beginning of the Republic. And these individuals are really quite what I'm going to call good citizens who attempt to make America truly one nation, who attempt to extend the blessings of liberty to all Americans and to make this a more perfect union. So when the Constitution is ratified, men like Prince Hall are the quintessential patriots, because though there may be men who are willing to compromise these goals and enslave their fellow Americans, Revolutionary War veterans, patriots like Prince Hall, were not willing to compromise these goals and really wanted to put America on that course to a more perfect union with liberty and justice for all. Now, here we also have a lithograph of Prince, or Colonel Abdul Rahman Ibrahim. He was known as Prince in his 40 years of captivity, which is indeed his title because his father was the king of Futa Jalon, so he was indeed a prince. Now, I also want to point out that these early leaders in our community, like Prince Hall, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, George Lawrence out of New York, they believed that the goals so clearly stated in the Constitution, in the preamble of the Constitution, were anti-slavery, and that they could work in league with those goals, in pursuit of those goals, I should say, to end the tyranny of slavery and to gain their rights as citizens. And so we bring that up early in the exhibit to let you know that there's this belief that they can indeed end slavery in league with the Constitution. Now, we see a reoccurring theme in early American history as we go to war. There is the military necessity of using or employing men of African descent. And in the War of 1812, African Americans could only serve in the Navy, in the naval services. In 1792, African Americans were banned from service in the federal militia. And some states like New York and then later Louisiana do make an exception. And this becomes key because General Andrew Jackson, is the one who convinces the governor of Louisiana, Claiborne, to lead the effort in the Louisiana state legislature to change the laws. And in October of 1814, they changed the law and allow these men of African descent to join the state militia of Louisiana. And they fight in the Battle of New Orleans, which is of note, the only land battle won by the U.S. forces, by the U.S. Army, in the War of 1812, and the battle was actually fought in January of 1815, which was after the treaty had been signed, but it was a victory. Now, in the Great Lakes, Commodore Perry, he had African-American sailors and Marines fighting with him, and that was where America's, let us say, glory of the War of 1812 was in the Great Lakes, in that campaign under Commodore Perry, and with African descent sailors and Marines fighting in the effort. Many of the founders believed that slavery would die off. Many of the founders of the Republic did not believe that slavery could survive as a viable economic institution. However, the cotton gin would change all of that, and cotton then becomes king. And when cotton becomes king, slavery becomes very profitable. And with the transatlantic slave trade banned in January of 1808, the domestic slave trade becomes very important in manning the cotton fields. Thomas Jefferson expressed his concern that the expansion of slavery, or let us say the conflict over the expansion of slavery into new territories, would lead to a civil war. Jefferson's concerns were echoed by the African descent community, who believed that that would occur. In fact, Reverend Absalom Jones would actually argue that in 1787, God came down and he laid out that constitution, and if the great houses, which means Pharaoh, if the great house did not set the captives free, then there was consequences, literally a curse, to use his introductory scripture, Exodus 3, 6 through 8. We're seeing something that's biblical in its unfolding. And so that was the argument. And even when you read Prince Hall or David Walker, they're speaking of being patient because they believe that there's going to be these developments. Now, one of the things we do in this exhibit that's quite different than any other exhibit, we are telling this story from the perspective of the African descent history makers. The Nat Turner activities in 1831, Southampton County, Virginia, are not described as a rebellion in this exhibit, because that's not how the African American history makers would describe it. In fact, Nat Turner would say in his interview, "You have asked me to give a history of the motives that led to this insurrection, as you call it." Notice he said, "as you call it." That's what he says to his interviewer, which means that's not what he called it. Now, what did he call it, and what did these African descent history makers call it? In our exhibit, we call it Nat Turner's demonstration, what Martin Delany would call it. And why a demonstration? Remember Reverend Absalom Jones's speech? God had come down. What does Moses do when he goes to the great house, the Pharaoh? He demonstrates the power of God, the curses of God, the power of God. Nat Turner's demonstration is like Moses. He's demonstrating that if you do not set the captives free, there's going to be a bloodletting, a parting of a Red Sea of blood. What Jefferson had referred to as the awakening of God's justice, and he says he was awoken by a fire bell in the night at his fear that that this holding others as slaves would lead to a civil war. Now, our exhibit moves from the intro panel into what I would call the main exhibit, and our header quotes are very important in each one of these panels. In this panel, we have a quote from Martin Delany, and Delany was a surgeon in Pittsburgh in the 1830s, becomes a major leader within our community, and particularly in recruiting European Americans to aid in what becomes the Underground Railroad. Again, from the perspective of our history makers, it's not European Americans leading the way in the Underground Railroad. It is African Americans leading the way in the Underground Railroad. Delany would publish a newspaper out of Pittsburgh called The Mystery. This anti-slavery newspaper would become the North Star in 1847, when Delany recruited, as he says, the famed and world-renowned Frederick Douglass. Delany is the co-founder and co-editor of the North Star. And also I just want to take a note of the language of Delany in The Mystery. This is 1846, and he says, "The Africo-American and African race." And this language, often when you see this kind of language, people think that it's kind of new 20th century language. This is an 1846 article in The Mystery. One of the things we attempt to accomplish in this exhibit is to do what Delany is saying here, is to find a place, or to allow these American heroes to have their place, these American patriots of African descent, their place in the records of merit and fame. And that's what we do in this exhibit. Now also I want to point out in this panel, one of the keys to recruiting European Americans to the anti-slavery movement were the slave narratives. Frederick Douglass really becomes world
renown because of how well written and his slave narrative was, and also how well spoken he was. But one of the most important slave narratives is coming from William Wells Brown, who becomes a novelist, a playwright, but he is enslaved. His narrative deals with his enslavement in Missouri. It was often said that Missouri was the most humane slavery of the slave states. Well, after reading William Wells Brown's narrative, if Missouri was the most humane, slavery was certainly not humane. Now, we move here to the gray header panels. In the gray header panels, we're dealing with the consequences of the Underground Railroad, the success of these African descent men and women fleeing to freedom. These freedom seekers causes the South to move toward a compromise that I want to point out that Delaney predicted would be made, and that compromise became known as the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed California to come in as a free state. It abolished the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and it made it a federal crime not to turn in a fugitive or to assist a fugitive, and slave hunters going into the North could get the U.S. Marshals to help them in retrieving their property. This happens in Christiana, Pennsylvania, where William Parker, a man of African descent who had run away from Maryland years earlier, had bought a farm near Christiana, Pennsylvania. 4 runaways from Baltimore County, the Gorsuch plantation, seek refuge at Parker's farm. Parker gives them refuge, and Edward Gorsuch goes to Pennsylvania after he finds out where his, quote, property is, close quote, and he gets the help of the deputy U.S. Marshals. He goes to Parker's farm, ends the return of his property. Parker warns him that he needs to leave, that there's danger here. Gorsuch and Parker exchange fire. Gorsuch is killed, Gorsuch's son is wounded, and the deputy U.S. Marshal flees. Parker and the 4 fugitives, freedom seekers, make their way to Canada with the help of residents of Christiana, Pennsylvania. 38 residents of Christiana, Pennsylvania were indicted for treason. Those tried by a jury of their peers were found not guilty, and Southerners believed that this was a sign that the North had no intention of enforcing that Fugitive Slave Act. Now, a few months, actually about a months after this, William Nail, a lawyer out of Boston, records some events from a conference in Boston. One of the notable statements is, "Our brethren in the South should not be called prisoners of war." I consider it important that like William Parker, freedom, understand that no man can own the property of God and hold against their will, and not just accepting their captivity. That's why they're fleeing, seeking freedom. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passes in 54, and Kansas becomes known as Bloody Kansas. This, to some, is the beginning of what they will call the Civil War. It's when this is going on. African Americans believe that the war is on the horizon, and they actually believe in 1857 that there's going to be a war if John C. Fremont was elected president. He was not, and so Moses Dixon out of St. Louis would write that in 1857 there were 150,000 well-armed men of African descent ready to fight for their freedom. But they were told to stand down by their national chief, which means there's a national organization in the African American community planning for the war. They're told to stand down because the North and South were having a terrible struggle for the mastery of the slave question. So we're waiting for a clashing of arms, and we really see that later in another part of our exhibit. When we move to this exhibit, we want you to appreciate that slavery was about claiming human beings as property. That was an important part of it. And so we have a bill of sale for a young girl in Wilcox County, Alabama in 1834, Lethe sold for $600. Our Our header quote here is from Mary Ann Shadd Cary, one of the leading African-American women in the Underground Railroad and the anti-slavery movement, a publisher, published her own journal, The Provincial Freedman, and she is quite the noted intellect. Now, in 1851, January 1851, after the Fugitive Slave Act, 30 young, I'm going to call them young radicals, mostly Oberlin men, met in Columbus, Ohio, to discuss whether they could indeed end the tyranny of slavery in league with the Constitution and gain their rights as citizens. Hezekiah Ford Douglass, a native of Louisiana, who had gone north to attend Oberlin, he argued that we cannot achieve the gaining of our rights as citizens and ending the tyranny of slavery in league with the Constitution. He cited all the egregious acts of presidents, legislators, and justices. William Howard Day, an 1851 graduate of Oberlin with a master's in theology, rose and said, Mr. Douglass, no relation to Frederick Douglass, Mr. Douglass is confusing the Constitution with the men who are implementing it. That's like confusing the Bible with preachers who sin. I'm not going to throw away my Bible because preachers sin. And I'm not going to throw away the Constitution because of the frailties of these men. He goes on to say, and this is our header quote, I consider the Constitution the foundation of American liberties, and wrapping myself in the flag of the nation, I would plant myself upon that Constitution, and using the weapons they have given me, I would appeal to the American people for the rights thus guaranteed. William Howard Days won the day that day at a vote of 28-2. So even the young radicals in our community were determined to end slavery in league with the Constitution. That was the plan. That is what I will refer to as the master plan. Now, to give you a sense of that master plan, remember the Bloody Kansas, one of the heroes of Bloody Kansas for the Free Soilers was a Jayhawker by the name of John Brown. John Brown comes up with this idea that he is going to lead a slave insurrection. Well, when he comes up with this idea, he decides he's going to go to Canada, to Chatham, Canada West, to meet with the leading African Americans, William Howard Day and Martin Delany specifically, and to solicit their help. Now, Delany and Day had led the Negro Immigration Convention and had moved the headquarters of this, really what is an African descent secret society, to Chatham, Canada West. Now, often people say they were going to immigrate. They supported immigration. If you read Day and Delany very closely, they do not support immigration. They support, as Day says, ending slavery in league with the Constitution. When they moved to Chatham, they're only 50 miles from Detroit. They didn't go anywhere. They really didn't go anywhere. But they're outside of the reach of the deputy U.S. Marshals and the slave hunters, so they can bring fugitives in, they can train them militarily and prepare them for an opportunity to strike a blow for liberty. Well, Brown goes there, and he tries to recruit them. Now, Brown has written his own constitution. So Brown is like a captain. Is like a general in his own mind. He's a general, and he's going to lead these African Americans, assuming they have no plan, to follow him in his plan, which will begin with a raid on Harper's Ferry. When Martin Delany refuses to follow John Brown calls him a coward. Delany replied, Captain Brown does not know the man of whom he speaks. There exists no one in whose veins the blood of cowardice courses less freely, and it must not be said even by John Brown, close quote. Notice he called him Captain Brown. Captains do not lead generals. John Brown had fashioned himself as the general. Delany calls him a captain. Delany is functionally a general within our organization. We have a plan already. John Brown is valued on the tactical level. That's why he's a captain. Generals value captains, but generals don't follow captains. We should not expect Delany or Douglass to follow John Brown. He's a captain. Frederick Douglass would even call John Brown Captain Brown. Before John Brown even came up with this plan, the African American community knew what was coming. We were planning for it. Dr. John S. Rock, who is featured in our exhibit as a very important African-American leader. Dr. Rock was an 1852 graduate of the American Medical College in Philadelphia. He was a physician, a dentist, a school teacher, and the first African-American lawyer to be admitted to the bar of the U.S. Supreme Court. Dr. Rock, 3 years, 1 month, and 8 days before the Civil War begins, March 5th, 1858, said, quote, "Sooner or later, the clashing of arms will be heard in this country, and the black man's services will be needed. 150,000 freemen capable of bearing arms, and not all cowards and fools, and 750,000 slaves, wild with the enthusiasm caused by the dawn of a glorious opportunity of being able to strike a genuine blow for freedom, will be a power that the white man will be bound to respect. Will the blacks fight? Of course they will." Close quote. 3 years before the Civil War begins, America's African descent population is preparing for a glorious opportunity to strike a blow for liberty. We're waiting for the Civil War. We have a plan. And John Brown fit into that plan on a tactical level. By his raid on Harper's Ferry, he would bring this clashing of arms to clash sooner than later. He was used by us, not followed by our leadership.
What about,
Dred Scott. Oh, okay. Now, we do feature Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott decision issued on March 6, 1857, excuse me. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney wrote in the majority opinion that Negroes were being so inferior that they had no rights that the white men were bound to respect. So in other words, Dred Scott had no right to even sue for his freedom, though he had lived in the free states. Now, Dr. Rock would comment that Judge Taney has tried to outlaw the black man, but the black man will outlive Judge Taney. This is how it's interpreted. Often when we see 20th century interpretations, even by an African American scholar, they'll be saying, well, Dred Scott says that we weren't citizens, so we weren't citizens until... No. We need to understand that this was our birthright in this country. We had built the country. And men like John S. Rock or David Walker, Martin Delany weren't about to surrender that. So they weren't about to say, oh yeah, Judge Taney's right, we're not. No, they're saying, we're going to outlive Judge Taney. And that's what we're saying in this exhibit. We're giving this perspective of these strong men of African descent, women of African descent, who are not just taking it, they're fighting it. Now, when Lincoln is nominated as the Republican candidate, the African American community is really quite excited. One is that we believe that really basically all of the major Republicans, whether we're talking about Solomon P. Chase, Simon Cameron, or William Seward, if they are elected president, the clashing of arms will be heard, that there's going to be a war. So they believe that if Lincoln or any of those other three men I mentioned are elected, the war is going to begin. So America's African descent population is very enthusiastic about Lincoln's likelihood of winning. And when he does win the election, the day after at the Capitol, African Americans built the Capitol. At the Capitol, these African American laborers building the Capitol raised a column, and they named it the Lincoln Column, believing strongly that their opportunity to strike a blow for liberty was on the horizon. South Carolina believed strongly that the Lincoln administration, as they say in their causes of secession, that the Lincoln administration is going to try to end slavery where it already exists. So though some will say that Lincoln was, maybe he wasn't, he was a moderate, well, South Carolina believed he was going to try to abolish slavery. So did the African American community. We agreed with South Carolina. And South Carolina, when they secede, they let you know that it's about slavery, that they're seceding. And we believe that Lincoln's administration is indeed on our side of this in trying to abolish slavery, and so does South Carolina. Now, before Lincoln is inaugurated, though, the then president, the 15th president of the United States, James Buchanan, he tries to get through a constitutional amendment that would guarantee slavery. In fact, the first 13th Amendment was not an amendment to abolish slavery. It was an amendment to say that Congress can't pass any laws that would interfere with such a domestic institution as slavery. So it was to protect slavery. And that amendment did pass the House and the Senate and was signed by James Buchanan on March 2nd, 1861, 2 days before Abraham Lincoln is inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. Soon after Lincoln is inaugurated, open hostilities began on April 12, 1861, with the firing on Fort Sumter, Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops from the states, but men of African descent cannot answer that call for volunteer soldiers or troops because it's illegal. Remember that 1792 law banned the enlistment of men of African descent into the federal army. So it's important to note that Lincoln, in the executive branch of government, had no legal authority to arm men of African descent. It's going to take an act of Congress. But African Americans, they do submit letters to the War Department volunteering their efforts. One of note that's in the records of the National Archives is a letter from an African American doctor from Battle Creek, Michigan, Dr. G.P. Miller. And Dr. Miller, in his letter, says that he can raise 5,000 to 10,000 men that can report in days to any position that may be assigned us, sharpshooters preferred. Now, what's important here? To ask for sharpshooters preferred means that these are trained men. They know how to use the weapons. This is important to understand about America's African descent population. We had prepared for this opportunity. Allen Pinkerton, he observed that. Our header quote in this panel is Pinkerton saying, quote, although they had prevented from taking up arms in defense of their rights, these colored men had banded themselves together to further the cause of freedom, close quote. Now, Pinkerton refers to these colored men who had banded themselves together as the Loyal League, a secret African descent organization that would become the single most important source of tactical and strategic intelligence during the Civil War. A secret African descent organization that would provide the most prolific recruiters of African Americans for the Union war effort. This secret African descent organization that Pinkerton identifies as the Loyal League sought to end slavery in league with the Constitution. That's William Howard Day, Martin Delany, John S. Rupp. We had a plan, and now the plan is unfolding as our forefathers had forecasted, had predicted. Now again, the Union Army cannot use African Americans legally. The Confederacy Army, does. But how do they use them? Not as soldiers, but as enslaved persons in pressed labor, working for the Confederate war effort in combat service support roles. And in May of 1863, we get these three men of African descent, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory, who come into Union lines at Fortress Monroe and convince General Benjamin Butler to give them refuge. When the Confederate officer came to retrieve their property, Butler told him that you rebels are waging war against the United States, and you're using these men you claim as property to wage war against the United States, so I'm going to confiscate said property as contraband of war. And that's where we get this term, contraband. Confiscated property, contraband of war. Now, in August of 1861, when Congress passed the legislation that authorized the confiscation of such property, it was restricted to those used directly in support of the military. So just anybody couldn't be confiscated and given refuge behind Union lines. Butler does write the Secretary of War, at that time Simon Cameron, and tells that he's going to give refuge to fathers and mothers and children of these individuals coming in because the so-called masters would persecute them. So you do have Butler extending that in Fortress Monroe, but later on when he's in New Orleans, he will not extend that kind of privilege. When we first get the discussion of emancipation, it is actually and the use of African Americans as soldiers, it's in the annual report of December 1861 by then Secretary of War Simon Cameron. And Cameron is arguing that it only makes sense that we use these African descent folk as soldiers and get them involved. Lincoln does have introduced a resolution dealing with emancipation on March 6, 1862. And Lincoln is arguing that if it becomes an indispensable, a military necessity to bring them in to our effort to emancipate slaves, we should do this. All indispensable means to save the Union is what Lincoln is arguing to Congress. Well, Congress is hesitant, but Congress also understands that the paramount objective of the war is to protect the Union. And Lincoln again is telling them we need any indispensable means to preserve the Union. In the spring of 1862, Union General McClellan had assembled arguably the best trained and best equipped army in the world. His army, largest army in the Western Hemisphere. He marched the army up the Virginia Peninsula to within 10 miles of the capital, Richmond, Virginia, by the 1st of June, 1862. Now, things are looking good for the Union. 10 miles from Richmond captured, the war is going to be over. Now, I want to go back to February of 62. John S. Rock is saying that the rebellion means something. In other words, he sees that clashing of arms, that opportunity to strike a blow for liberty. But if McClellan captures Richmond, the war is over, and slavery hasn't even been tabled. Deception becomes the key to General Robert E. Lee's victory. Lee is able to deceive McClellan into believing his army is 4 times its actual size. Lee is able to deceive McClellan into believing that wooden cannons, often called Quaker guns, were indeed real cannons. Lee deceived and outmaneuvered McClellan, and in the first week of July, 1862, word gets here to Washington that McClellan's army is in full retreat, suffering a humiliating defeat. In that July, Congress passed the Militia Act of 1862, granting President Lincoln the authority to arm men of African descent. This legislation, born of military necessity, was on President Lincoln's signature on July 17, 1862. President Lincoln both this piece of piece of legislation into law, plus the Second Confiscation Act. The Second Confiscation Act gave President Lincoln the authority to seize all property of persons in states in rebellion, and in Section 9 of the Second Confiscation Act, Congress declared free all persons held as slaves in states in rebellion. Lincoln signed both those pieces of legislation into law July 17, 1862. Now he had the authority to arm men of African descent and to declare free slaves in states in rebellion. Lincoln met with his cabinet. He informed his cabinet that he was going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation acting on the authority that Congress had given him. But his Secretary of State, William Seward, told the president to wait for a military success. And Lincoln, calling the proclamation a practical war measure, decided to wait for a military success so that they could mass their cry for help to African Americans' community. In fact, Seward would actually say to Lincoln that if you issue it now, quote, it may be viewed as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government stretching forth its hands unto Ethiopia instead of Ethiopia stretching out her hands unto the government, close quote. So Lincoln is waiting for a military success. He does not want the voting public to know that they need African Americans to save the Union, to maintain the supremacy of the Constitution. Now, African Americans, one thing we deal with in this panel is the fact that African Americans are quite active. We're not just sitting around on our hands either. Nicholas Bill just volunteered. He wasn't a paid member of the Washington Artillerists, of Pennsylvania Artillery Battery, but he still served with them. In fact, he's often considered the first casualty of the Civil War because he was hit with a as his regiment was marching down Pratt Street in Baltimore. And when he finally reached Washington, Lincoln did go and visit him. In the swamps, whether we're talking about North Carolina, South Carolina, or Louisiana, African Americans have safe havens in swamps. And these are become very valuable guerrilla fighters during the Civil War. One of the most noted heroes early in the war, before men of African descent could legally join the army, is Robert Smalls, when with 8 of his fellow crewmen aboard a Confederate ship called Panther on May 12, 1862, commandeered the ship and turned that ship over to the Union Army. Smalls would later become a captain of that ship. In South Carolina, you have in May of 1862, a regiment that is organized illegally. The 1st South Carolina is organized illegally by General David Hunter. Now, Hunter's illegally organized regiment was really organized and put together by an African American by the name of Prince Rivers. Prince Rivers is a very important leader in American history and in South Carolina history, and he's a military leader of note. He is a very skilled military man from the very beginning, and later when this regiment would be organized legally, he would become a first sergeant in the regiment and would often lead patrols on their raids as commander with no European American officer over him. In fact, Colonel Thomas Woodson said that if he had more refinement in education, he could have certainly been the commander of the Army of the Potomac, a general, if you will. This regiment was organized legally after August 25th, 1862, when Secretary of War Edwin Stanton gave instructions to General Rufus Saxton to organize that regiment. So this regiment is organized before the Emancipation Proclamation is issued. And the Louisiana Regiment is organized as well, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's get to the Emancipation Proclamation. The victory that Lincoln was waiting for, the victory at Antietam. It's a 22,000 casualties. Well over half of those 22,000 are Union soldiers, but the rebels under Robert E. Lee withdrew from the battlefield, so the Union Army under George McClellan claimed a victory. And 5 days later, Lincoln would issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in which he warned the state rebellion that if they did not return to the Union, he was going to free their slaves. Well, the rebels, of course, do not return because they believe they're winning the war. And for all practical purposes, they are. Lincoln issues his proclamation on January 1, 1863. This is a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. And when he issues his proclamation, Lincoln says in the proclamation that it was, quote, a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, close quote. Notice the president's language. He didn't say that this is a moral or humanitarian document. He said it's a fit and necessary war measure for accomplishing the paramount objective of the war, which was to preserve the Union. He even says in the proclamation that it was, quote, warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. So in this fit and necessary war measure, Lincoln declared forever free all persons held as slaves in 10 states that were at war with the United States for their independence, in the states that did not accept him as president. So are the governors in those states going to set anyone free because Abraham Lincoln said so on January 1, 1863? Absolutely not. The only way they're going to be set free is by military conquest. And that's the story of our soldiers and sailors. They answer a cry for help from the federal government. They helped save the Union, and they freed themselves. And when they rode into camp, you captured no better than this quote by General Benjamin Butler. Better soldiers never shouldered a musket. Butler is talking about Louisiana soldiers that are the first to be mustered into federal service. In September and October of 1862, Louisiana soldiers are the first to be officially mustered into federal service. The 1st and 2nd Louisiana Native Guard. Also of note, all of the captains and lieutenants, all the line officers in those two regiments were men of African descent. And I want to read this quote by Butler when he's talking about these soldiers. He would say, I observed a very remarkable trait about them. They learned to handle arms and to march more easily than intelligent white men. My drill master could teach a regiment of Negroes that much more of the art of war sooner than he could have taught the same number of students from Harvard or Yale. These are very competent soldiers. Not only competent, but the generals who are witnessing their abilities are giving them rave reviews. More intelligent than students from Harvard and Yale when it comes to the military arts. We need to appreciate what our forefathers were really like. And in this exhibit, that's what we're doing. We talk about the Louisiana Native Guards being the first to come in. They're in battle quite soon. October 25th, 1862, they captured Donaldsonville, Louisiana. So they're in combat early. The 1st Northern Regiment is a Kansas regiment. And this Kansas regiment, it gets into battle in Missouri in October 29th, 1862. So these early regiments are in battle. And going back to the South Carolina Regiment, they were running raids down the coast of Georgia and Florida in 1862. So before the Emancipation Proclamation, they're in battle and they are successful. Now I'm going to move here, before I get to soldiers' duties, to this panel. couple of things we do in this panel that are of note to me. First, we begin with a header quote by General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant wrote in August of 1863, 1 month after he had captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, which Lincoln had called the key to victory. Grant had secured the key to victory on July 4th, 1863, with the help of African-American soldiers, sailors, guides, scouts, and spies. And Grant would write to President Lincoln, quote, "By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally," close quote. Notice the general's language. He didn't say by freeing the Negro. He said by arming the Negro. And he did not say we've added more bodies to our army. That's not what the general said. You might hear that from contemporary scholars. That's not what the general said. The general said we've added what? A powerful ally. That's Michael Vick, Ray Lewis, Adrian Peterson. You get my point. Difference makers on the battlefield. That's what the general is saying. And that's very clear. One incident, this is April 12th, 1864. A Confederate force of over 2,000 men attack a Union fort 50 miles north of Memphis called Fort Pillow. 575 men, of which about 255 are African-American artillerymen. The Confederates overrun the fort with their 2,000 versus 500 men, and they take no quarters, which means that the prisoners of war are killed and not taken as prisoners of war. This is referred to as the Fort Pillow Massacre. Most of the time, when you hear the Fort Pillow Massacre, the story comes to an end. They were just whipped. These colored troops outnumbered 2,000 to 500, or these Union troops outnumbered 2,000 to 500, were just whipped. And that's the end of the story. In most of what you're not in this exhibit, we tell whole stories. We don't just tell the story of a football game in the first quarter. We tell the story of the whole game. And when you tell it, General John Alexander Logan would write, "The cry with which our Union black regiments went into battle, 'Remember Fort Pillow,' inspired them to deeds of valor, and struck with fear the hearts of the enemy. On many a bloody field, Fort Pillow was avenged." These soldiers are extremely good fighters, and the Confederates pay a price for what they did at Fort Pillow. We tell whole stories. Remember, we're telling the story of the victors, not simply the victims. Now, the Bureau of United States Colored Troops was established May 22nd, 1863. And this is the bureau that handles all United States Colored Troops. So the regiments that were even organized before that, they're brought into United States Colored Troops. Lincoln had placed a priority on recruiting and had actually sent the Adjutant General of the Army, Lorenzo Thomas, out to the Mississippi Valley to recruit African Americans. And they would fight in some key battles that I'll mention in a moment. One of the most famed battles is the assault on Fort Wagner on July 18th, 1863. Many people who have seen the movie Glory are left with the impression that this was a regiment of mostly runaway slaves that was wiped out in this assault on Fort Wagner, when in truth the 54th Massachusetts was a regiment of mostly free men, and mostly literate men. And in this assault, they lost 54 to fatalities. 30 killed in action and 24 mortally wounded out of 600. That's less than 10% fatalities. But if you ever watch the movie Glory, they'll say that it was over 50% of them died, that were lost. No, 54 out of 600, it's not close to 50%, it's less than 10%. And they also say in the postscript of the movie that the fort was never taken. They're talking about Fort Wagner, Morris Island, Carolina. This fort was captured, taken on September 7th, 1863, by United States Colored Troops to include the 54th Massachusetts, thus commencing the siege and bombardment of Charleston. So, very successful, and this is a quote from a letter from one of the African-American Corporal Henry S. Harmon of the 3rd United States Colored Infantry, which was out of Pennsylvania, and theirs was the first regiment to enter Fort Wagner, and this letter initially appeared in the Recorder, an AME journal out of Philadelphia. Now let's move over to this side again. One of the things with unquestionable courage, one of the things that was noted early with these soldiers was just how courageous they were and how they went into battle. They were quite fearless. Many of them believed that if they were to die in battle, it was because God had called them home, because they believed that they were doing the work of God in liberating his oppressed people. Literally, they were God's soldiers, or as they called them, members of a gospel army, or God's army. And so these were men of faith who were formidable foes and often fearless without being careless on the battlefield. So unquestionable courage. Now, in this panel, we deal with the soldier's duty and the fact that African Americans are serving in every branch. Cavalry, horse soldiers, African Americans are serving in the infantry, the foot soldiers. Now, I do want to point out that African Americans get more than their share of fatigue duty. But there are couple of reasons why. One is racism. Yes, that's it. However, remember, these are quite good soldiers. So, of course, you want them fighting. But there's also another important factor. African Americans, regiments during the Civil War, had more men available for duty than any other regiments, regulars or volunteers. We are so into fighting that even when we're sick, we'll keep fighting. So we have more men available. In readiness, in the modern military, you would consider that your most ready unit. And that was African Americans in the Civil War. We have on display some of the weapons used: a Colt 44 revolver. This is a Colt musket. Now, we have a couple of muskets in our exhibit. African Americans were in artillery. This is an artilleryman out of a Rhode Island regiment, so they're firing the cannons. They're musicians. Now, a musician during the Civil War, he did not have to know how to play music. In today's military, the soldier that does the job that the field musician did, or drummer boy, would be called a field radio operator or communicator. Again, he did not have to know how to play music. The drummer boy needed to know what the series of beats meant for each command so that he could relay the commands of the commander. He was a signalman. Average age of a drummer boy during the Civil War was 15 years old. Youngest drummer boy to serve, Elijah Mason of the 114th United States Colored Troops, and he was 8 years old when he enlisted. Now, most exhibits and most literature on the Civil War would say that it was a 9-year-old European-American boy, because this is the best-kept secret in American history. They just weren't counting Elijah Mason, but we count Elijah Mason. Some regiments did have bands, and they did play music. Now, also, when it comes to manual labor, it's often said that this is kind of unimportant duties. I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps, and I hate to think that critical duties in a combat zone, like building fortifications, is not important duty. This is important work. So we take note of the fact that that's important work. Pioneers are in today's military are combat engineers. And then we show African Americans involved in raids. And here the capture of Confederate generals by African American cavalrymen. African Americans involved in Sherman's Atlanta campaign, which is often said they were not involved. But let's move here into this portion of the exhibit. We talk about the women. The military contributions of the women. And we have a quote from Frances Ellen Harper, one of the most eloquent writers of her age, an African-American woman who was a wonderful poet and novelist, playwright. African-American women on the home front are key in keeping these families together, especially during the time when the soldiers aren't receiving their equal pay, and some of them do not receive any pay at all. It is the women on the home front that become very key in helping these families survive. When it comes to teachers in the freedmen's villages, whether we're talking about South Carolina or in the Washington, D.C. area, women play a major role. One of the biggest heroes of the Civil War is a woman by the name of Mary Trevestre, also known as Mary Lou Vestre. She literally saves the Union Navy early in the war when she steals the plans of the USS Merrimack. The Confederates are turning it into an ironclad called the CSS Virginia. She steals the plans, brings them to Washington, and that expedites the production of the Union ironclad, the USS Monitor. It is Mary Trevestre, or Lou Vestre, this African-American woman, that really is key in saving the Union Navy in the first year of the war and making sure the blockade can work, which is key to the Union strategy. African-American women also play key roles in helping Union prisoners of war escape from Confederate prisoner of war camps. African-American women play a key role in that. African-American women serve as nurses. Susie King Taylor would write a memoir of her experiences as a nurse. 5 African-American women serve aboard a ship called the Red Rover, and are legally enlisted in the Navy. So we have 5 African American women legally enlisted in the Navy. Two women of note. One is Harriet Tubman, who goes deep into the South, behind enemy lines in South Carolina, and would become a guide, scout, and spy, and the only woman in American history to lead U.S. soldiers on a raid. June of 1863, she led a raid down the Combahee River in South Carolina. And she would write after the raid to a friend of hers that she took part and not a single life was lost on our part, but we have good reason to believe that a number of rebels bit the dust. That's Harriet Tubman talking about our raid. Another woman of note. Now, here we have a commissioning order from Governor O.P. Morton of Indiana, commissioning Mary Ann Shadd Cary as a recruiting officer, the only woman in the Civil War to be commissioned a recruiting officer. Now, in this panel, we deal with the Navy. The Navy was integrated. The Navy was integrated since 1798. And African American sailors serve aboard every ship there is in the Navy, every class of ship. And so wherever the Navy sailed, the Union Navy sailed, African American sailors, were there. African American sailors are in Europe when they stop in Europe. In fact, aboard the USS Niagara, he's talking about his trip to Europe and what it was like on leave when he came back. This is William Gould, an African-American sailor aboard the Niagara, originally out of North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina. The first African-American to receive the Medal of Honor was Robert Blake, who received his medal on April 16, 1864, for actions aboard the U.S. steam gunboat Marblehead on December 25, 1863, off of Johns Island in South Carolina. Now, notice that Blake's action is December 25, 1863. He receives his medal less than 5 months later, on April 16, 1864. And most of the sailors, you will see that John Lawson would receive his medal on April 4th, on December 31st, 1864, for actions on August 5th, 1864, and 4 other African Americans receive medals on the exact same day. The first African Americans to receive medals are sailors. 7 African American sailors received the Congressional Medal of Honor, and 8 of them earned it. One African American, the reason he didn't receive his medal is because when his ship was transferred from Norfolk to Boston, he decided he wasn't going to go with the ship, so he deserted and did not receive his medal, even though he merited the ship. One of the African-American recipients, Jacobin Pease, he received his medal in the famed battle off the coast of France between the USS Kearsarge and the CSS Alabama. The sinking of the Alabama. There are songs about the sinking of the Alabama, and Jacobin Pease, an African-American sailor, seaman Jacobin Pease, received his Medal of Honor for actions on June 19, 1864, off the coast of France, and he received his medal on December 31st, 1864. So often you'll hear people saying the first African-American to receive the Medal of Honor was William Carney in May of 1900. He's actually the 51st. And so we get that straight in our exhibit. And then we talk about the sailors in there. And this is a photograph from a sailor, and then the Monitor, African Americans serve aboard the Monitor. In fact, our first photograph is an African American serving aboard the Monitor. Also, the Navy does a number of things that often people don't consider. And it's naval gunfire, which supports the ground forces, like in African American soldiers fighting in Milliken's Bend, which is a part of the Vicksburg campaign. They didn't have all of their weapons, and it was mostly hand-to-hand combat. 36 hours of hand-to-hand combat, and when they defeat the Confederates, what's really key in their defeating of the Confederates is the naval gunfire. That really helps these African American soldiers there. And then naval reconnaissance, getting information about the enemy, is very important, and naval reconnaissance, and these African Americans played a key role, especially since they were such good guides, scouts, and spies. Now, African Americans are serving in every major campaign near the end of the war. Often it is said that they did not serve in Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Yet Sherman said that the great question of his Atlanta campaign was one of supplies. Then he assigned 11 United States colored troop regiments to guard his supplies, to address his great question. And Sherman would even later write that the best example in the history of war of skill and bravery was conducted by those who guarded his supply lines from Nashville to Atlanta. These are African-American soldiers. He's saying the best example of skill and bravery in the history of warfare are African-American soldiers, if you know who guarded his supply lines. And we know, because that's the story we tell at this museum. Petersburg-Richmond campaign, General Grant, when he became General-in-Chief of the Army in March of 1864, there were 0 United States colored troops in the Army of the Potomac. 1 year later, 33% of the Army of the Potomac is comprised of United States colored troops. Why? Grant wanted his powerful ally on the battlefield in what is arguably the most important campaign in the war, the campaign to capture Richmond, Virginia. Grant would place his African descent soldiers, his powerful allies, on the front lines before Richmond. Now, often it is said that African American soldiers are on the front line because they're expendable. They're cannon fodder. I don't know, whoever says that, I don't know what military theorist, American military theorist, they've been reading. Not a single general will tell you that, not a single military theorist, because in the U.S. military, we send our best out front. I spent 21 years in the Marine Corps. Marines go in first, why? Because we're the best. 82nd Airborne goes in first, why? Because they're the best. 101st Airborne goes in first, why? Because they're the best. Grant put these African descent soldiers on the front line before Richmond. Why? Because they're the best. In fact, Thomas Morris Chester, an African-American journalist, would write, one of the best evidences of the confidence in the valor of colored troops is manifest in the fact that they entrusted with holding the right of our line, which is the nearest point we possess to Richmond. He put them on the front lines before Richmond because he thought so highly of them. These are outstanding soldiers.
Now,
Yes.
okay,